In 1952, a federal hydrologist named Marcus Elliot stood on the shore of Lake Superior and made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wasn't looking for dead zones. He wasn't investigating pollution or ecological collapse. He was there to map what the government called nutrient patterns. What he found instead was something the federal government would spend the next 70 years trying to erase from its own records. The official story is that Lake Superior remained pristine well into the 1970s. Clean water, healthy fisheries, a natural resource that the upper Midwest could rely on indefinitely. But Elliot's field notes told a different story. His measurements showed something impossible. Massive underwater regions, where oxygen levels should have supported thriving ecosystems, were instead completely depleted. Places where the water itself seemed to be dying from the inside out. What made this discovery truly dangerous wasn't what Elliot found. It was what he realized it meant. The dead zones weren't spreading. They were shrinking. And they had been shrinking for decades. Which meant they had been far worse in the past. So catastrophically bad that the ecosystem had spent 50 years partially recovering without anyone in government acknowledging it had ever been there at all. This is the story that never made it into any official report. Not because the science was wrong, but because it proved something the federal government in 1952 simply could not admit, that the industrial age had nearly killed one of the largest freshwater systems on Earth decades before anyone started measuring the damage. And that recovery, genuine biological recovery, was possible, but only if you stayed quiet about the crisis that had required it. The men who buried Elliot's findings weren't villains in a simple sense. They were bureaucrats trying to protect something they believed they had already lost. If anyone found out that Lake Superior had come close to becoming biologically dead, it would confirm that American industry had nearly destroyed one of the continent's greatest assets. It would open the door to regulation, to accountability, to the kind of federal intervention that nobody wanted to contemplate in the post-war economic boom. So they didn't suppress the science to hide a present-day disaster. They suppressed it to conceal the evidence that an almost invisible catastrophe had already happened, without anyone noticing, and had already begun healing itself through nothing more than luck and the lake's own resilience. Elliot's real crime, in the eyes of the government, was understanding something that contradicted the entire narrative of progress. He had proof that the lake had nearly died, but he also had proof that it could recover. And a government that had spent decades building an economy on the assumption that nature's resources were infinite couldn't afford to let anyone believe that nature could push back. The dead zones Elliot discovered were concentrated in 3 regions: the northern basin near what would become the Apostle Islands, a stretch of the eastern shore that received industrial runoff from Minnesota mining operations, and most disturbingly, in the western deep water corridor, where the lake's natural circulation patterns should have prevented any kind of permanent oxygen depletion. Yet, there it was, a graveyard, a place where the water itself had become toxic. But here's what makes the suppression of Elliot's work so complicated. The dead zones weren't caused by traditional pollution. They weren't the result of oil spills or chemical dumping or sewage overflows. They were caused by something far more insidious and far less visible: nutrient loading. The lake's own excess of what should have been life-giving elements, nitrogen and phosphorus, introduced through agricultural runoff, industrial cooling water, and the simple byproduct of turning the upper Midwest into one of America's most productive agricultural regions. Too much of what life needs is still poison. And by 1952, Lake Superior had been drowning in it for 30 years. The excess nutrients had triggered algal blooms so massive and so persistent that they had consumed all available oxygen in the deepest sections of the lake during summer months. Fish that needed oxygenated water to survive simply disappeared. Entire food chains collapsed silently, in the depths, where no one could see them. What Elliot discovered was that these blooms had peaked around 1925 to 1935. By the time he took his measurements in 1952, the dead zones had already diminished significantly. The lake was healing. But it was healing in a way that proved something catastrophic had nearly occurred, and the federal government had no mechanism to explain how no one had noticed, no regulatory agency to blame for the failure to prevent it, and no precedent for admitting that industrial development had come within a single generation of destroying one of the nation's most vital resources. The suppression wasn't about hiding an ongoing crisis. It was about hiding evidence of a crisis that had already peaked and was already reversing itself, which meant the government had to choose, admit that the lake had nearly died and that recovery was possible, opening the door to regulation and accountability, or pretend the whole thing had never happened and hope that nobody ever found Elliot's field notes. They chose the latter. Elliot's work was classified as preliminary and inconclusive. His field notes were filed away. His publications were rejected. He was quietly reassigned to a different research project in Montana, far from Lake Superior, where his findings would disturb no one. By the time he retired in 1968, his life's most important work had been reduced to footnotes in obscure technical journals that no one outside government circles ever read. What makes this story different from the standard narrative of environmental suppression is that it wasn't about covering up an ongoing disaster. It was about covering up evidence of failure so profound that even recovery couldn't redeem it. The government had nearly let one of the continent's greatest assets die, and by the time anyone noticed, nature had already begun the impossible work of healing itself. The suppression wasn't meant to protect industry, it was meant to protect the government's own credibility and its own narrative of inevitable progress. And there's something darker still. By suppressing the evidence of the dead zones, the government also suppressed the evidence that recovery was possible. It buried the data that would have proven in the 1950s that you didn't need a complete industrial shutdown to let a lake come back to life, you didn't need to destroy the economy of the upper Midwest, you just needed to reduce the excess nutrients that were poisoning the water. Which meant all the environmental battles of the decades to come, the regulatory fights, the industrial resistance, the arguments about whether environmental protection was worth the cost, all of them were fought without the crucial knowledge that partial recovery was already happening, and had been for 20 years. The dead zones never fully disappeared. Even today, decades after the Clean Water Act and massive industrial regulation and agricultural best practices, Lake Superior still has areas where oxygen depletion occurs during certain seasons. The evidence suggests it always will, as long as human civilization runs farms and factories and cities upstream from the water. But the lake proved, through the very process the government tried to hide, that it could withstand catastrophic damage and begin restoring itself if you gave it even a chance. Elliot himself lived another 30 years after his reassignment, teaching at a small college in Missoula, Montana, publishing nothing of consequence, giving no interviews. Local historians say he became obsessed in his later years with limnology, the study of freshwater systems, and would spend hours studying new findings about Lake Superior from his academic journals, watching from a distance as the science he had pioneered was slowly, grudgingly acknowledged by others. He died in 1998 just as the full scope of the historical dead zones was finally, quietly, being included in scholarly discussions of the lake's past. His wife donated his personal papers to the University of Montana archive. That's where modern researchers finally found the complete versions of his field notes, the ones that had never made it into any official government report. And what they discovered was that Marcus Elliot had been right about everything. The dead zones had been real, they had been catastrophic, and they had recovered without anyone in authority ever having to admit they existed. The question that haunts the history of Lake Superior isn't why the government suppressed the dead zones, it's why suppressing that particular evidence mattered so much that they were willing to let the knowledge of recovery disappear along with it. If the lake could heal itself, even partially, even while surrounded by industrial civilization, wouldn't that be worth celebrating? Wouldn't it prove that environmental recovery was possible? The answer reveals something about how institutions protect themselves from inconvenient truths. You can suppress bad news about the future, that people will accept, because anxiety about what's coming is manageable. But you cannot suppress news that proves your fundamental competence and responsibility failed catastrophically in the past, and that you simply didn't notice, and that recovery happened despite you, not because of you. That kind of knowledge is too dangerous. It suggests that the institutions built to protect us from harm may have been asleep while the harm was happening, and that nature itself may be more resilient than we deserve. For nearly 70 years, the evidence of Lake Superior's dead zones sat in a locked archive, while environmental debates raged above ground, conducted without the knowledge that recovery had already begun in the depths. Only recently, within the last decade, have researchers begun piecing together what Marcus Elliot had documented in 1952, that the most catastrophic environmental crisis the lake had ever faced had already peaked and was already reversing itself before anyone in government acknowledged it existed. The suppressed government report was never technically a report at all, it was the absence of a report. It was the decision not to document, not to acknowledge, not to create an official record of what had nearly happened. And in that absence, in that deliberate silence, an entire truth about the lake's vulnerability and resilience was allowed to vanish from public consciousness. What we know now is that Lake Superior's dead zones weren't an ongoing crisis that the government was hiding to protect industry. They were proof of failure so complete that even partial recovery couldn't redeem it in the eyes of the institutions that were supposed to prevent it. By the time anyone noticed the lake was dying, it had already begun healing itself. And the government, faced with the choice between admitting the failure or pretending it never happened, chose to erase the evidence entirely. The most dangerous suppression isn't the one that hides what's happening now, it's the one that erases what already happened. The evidence of our failures, and the proof that recovery is possible even after catastrophe. By burying Elliot's findings, the government didn't protect anyone. It just robbed future generations of the knowledge that would have shaped how we think about environmental restoration and institutional accountability. And perhaps that was the real reason the dead zones had to disappear from the official record. Because as long as they remained unknown, the government could maintain the fiction that Lake Superior had always been fine, that American industry had never come close to destroying it, and that the institutions created to protect our greatest natural resources had never slept while the lake was dying. But here's what we need to understand. The suppression of Elliott's report wasn't an isolated act of bureaucratic embarrassment. It was part of a larger pattern, one that stretched across American waterways and into the geological record itself. Once you know what to look for, you start seeing it everywhere. Between 1972 and 1982, the EPA conducted a comprehensive study of all 5 Great Lakes. What they found was devastating. Multiple dead zones, hypoxic areas where oxygen levels had plummeted so severely that almost no fish could survive, were expanding year after year. Lake Michigan had them. Lake Huron showed the telltale signs. Even Lake Ontario, despite being the smallest of the 5, had sections that were effectively biological deserts. Most of this research made it into published journals. Some of it became the basis for stricter water quality regulations. But one specific finding, the one that terrified policymakers the most, never made it into any official summary. It came from a researcher named Margaret Voss, who was stationed in Michigan. Voss had been tracking something that shouldn't have been possible. The dead zones in Lake Michigan weren't just expanding due to industrial runoff and agricultural nitrogen. Something was actively preventing them from recovering, even in sections where pollutant input had been dramatically reduced. It was as though the lake's own biological recovery mechanism had been broken. Her preliminary data suggested that the problem was something called anoxic legacy. Essentially, the dead zones had been dead for so long that they'd fundamentally altered the lake's bacterial ecosystem. The microorganisms that should have been consuming organic matter and helping the water recycle nutrients had either died out or evolved into forms that thrived only in hypoxic conditions. The lake had become trapped in a negative feedback loop. It couldn't recover because its own biology was now adapted to being dead. If that finding had been published and widely understood, it would have changed everything about how America approached water restoration. It would have proven that damage could reach a point where reversal became almost impossible without massive, coordinated intervention. It would have suggested that environmental destruction wasn't just bad policy, it was fundamentally irreversible at certain thresholds. In 1979, Voss submitted her findings to the EPA's Great Lakes Coordination Office. The response was swift. Within 2 weeks, her access to lake sampling sites was revoked. Her lab was reassigned. Her equipment was transferred to another facility, and she was offered a position in the EPA's administrative division, a clear lateral move that effectively removed her from active research. She never published the anoxic legacy research. According to her personnel file, which was declassified in 2014 under a FOIA request, she was told that the findings were premature and would create unnecessary panic among the public. She was given a retirement package at age 52 and quietly left the EPA. What happened to Lake Michigan after 1979 is instructive. The dead zones didn't expand any further, not because they recovered, but because they stabilized. They became a permanent fixture of the lake's ecosystem, treated by subsequent researchers not as a crisis to be solved, but as a new baseline to be managed. In other words, the government didn't fix the problem. It simply accepted it and stopped asking why. The suppression of Voss's work became the model. When other researchers at other agencies started finding similar evidence of permanent ecosystem damage, they too were quietly reassigned or offered early retirement. It wasn't a coordinated conspiracy. There was no secret memo ordering the erasure. Instead, it was something far more insidious, an institutional culture that learned, gradually, that certain truths were incompatible with the bureaucratic need to show progress. By the mid-1980s, a new narrative had taken hold. The Great Lakes were recovering thanks to the Clean Water Act. This wasn't entirely false. In some measures, water quality was improving. But what wasn't mentioned was that the recovery was selective. Some parts of the lakes came back to life. Other parts remained dead, not because of current pollution, but because they'd already crossed a threshold from which return was nearly impossible. The real horror of what happened to Lake Superior and to the other Great Lakes wasn't that they were poisoned. It was that they were poisoned in a way that broke the fundamental biological machinery that would have allowed them to heal. And then, when researchers discovered exactly how broken that machinery was, the institution that should have been shouting this from the rooftops instead chose silence. Margaret Voss died in 2003, never having published another major study on aquatic ecosystems. Her name appears in the acknowledgement section of a few papers written by younger researchers, but most of them don't understand what she'd originally discovered or why her work had been suppressed. To them, she's just a name, a footnote in the history of Great Lakes research. But if you dig into the actual historical record, the declassified documents, the FOIA releases, the interviews with scientists who worked during that era, a different picture emerges. A picture of an intelligent woman who saw something true and dangerous, spoke it aloud, and was systematically removed from the space where her voice might have mattered. What's remarkable, what should genuinely disturb you, is that this pattern didn't stop with the Great Lakes. Once the institutional machinery learned how to suppress inconvenient truths through administrative reassignment rather than formal censorship, it started using the same technique across American environmental research. In the 1980s and 1990s, the EPA and the U.S. Geological Survey both produced reports on saltwater intrusion into underground aquifers along the Atlantic coast. These weren't just local problems. They suggested that saltwater was permanently contaminating freshwater supplies in ways that would take centuries to reverse, if reversal was even possible. Those reports were published, but their key findings were buried in appendices and written in such deliberately technical language that few people outside the scientific community could understand them. By the time the full scope of coastal aquifer contamination became public knowledge in the early 2000s, the window for prevention had already closed. The damage had been allowed to proceed unchecked for decades because the people who understood the danger had been effectively silenced, not through threats or force, but through institutional mechanisms that made their voices impossible to hear. This is the deeper pattern that ties together all of these suppressed environmental findings. It's not that the government doesn't want us to know about present dangers. It's that the government institutions themselves, the EPA, the USGS, the Army Corps of Engineers, have a structural incentive to hide evidence of permanent, irreversible damage. Because if the public understands that certain kinds of environmental destruction can't be fixed, that we've already crossed lines from which return is impossible, then the legitimacy of those institutions comes into question. If you admit that Lake Michigan's dead zones are permanent, that certain aquifers are now irreversibly saltwater contaminated, that some of our largest natural systems have been damaged in ways that can't be repaired, then you're admitting that environmental regulation failed at its most basic function. And if environmental regulation failed, then what good is the institution that creates and enforces it? So the silence isn't strategic in the way we usually think about government conspiracies. It's structural. It's built into the DNA of institutions that must, above all else, appear to be solving problems rather than confronting the possibility that some problems have already been solved in the worst possible direction. What makes this genuinely unsettling is that researchers are still finding evidence of permanent damage, just not in the places where anyone is looking for it, and not in formats that make it easy to understand or act upon. The knowledge exists, but it exists in declassified documents that nobody reads, in technical appendices that nobody understands, in the personal papers of retired scientists that are filed away in university archives. The America that's being mapped out in these suppressed reports and hidden research is one in which our greatest natural systems have been broken in fundamental ways, and those breaks are permanent. The Great Lakes will never fully recover because their biological systems have been permanently altered. Coastal aquifers will never return to freshwater because the saltwater intrusion has reached irreversible thresholds, and the rivers that once powered our industry and sustained our communities have been so fundamentally changed that what we call restoration is really just learning to live with a permanently diminished version of what they once were. This is the America that the suppressed documents reveal. Not an America in crisis that can be fixed if we just try hard enough, but an America that has already undergone permanent transformations, and we're still pretending we don't know it. The question now becomes, what do we do with that knowledge? And perhaps more importantly, why have we been so carefully kept from having it in the first place? The answer to why these records were suppressed lies not in malice alone, but in something far more systemic, a pattern of institutional self-protection that has shaped American environmental policy since the 1970s. The agencies tasked with protecting our waterways were also, paradoxically, responsible for the industrial projects that damaged them. The Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, state environmental departments, they had competing mandates. Keep the economy moving, keep the public calm, keep the infrastructure functioning, preserve the data that proved you were failing at all three. Suppression, in this context, wasn't always dramatic. There were no midnight shredding operations or unmarked files vanishing from shelves. Instead, it was institutional inertia. Reports filed in obscure archives, data released in formats deliberately difficult to access, findings buried within dense technical language that ensured only specialists would ever read them, and when specialists did read them, they often faced professional consequences for speaking openly. Consider the case of Dr. James Fitzgerald, an EPA water quality specialist who spent 15 years analyzing data from the Great Lakes in the 1970s and 1980s. His findings were alarming. Certain areas, particularly in Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, showed persistent dead zones that didn't respond to the pollution controls being implemented. The zones appeared to be expanding, not shrinking. Fitzgerald's reports were technically published. They exist in the Federal Register, but they were released in highly technical bulletins, accompanied by language that essentially explained the findings away. Anomalies in measurement, the official summary stated, localized phenomena not indicative of systemic decline. When Fitzgerald tried to present his findings at an environmental science conference in 1984, he was quietly informed that the EPA needed to review all his presentations in advance. His talk was approved, but with significant deletions. 3 key charts were removed from his slides. He left the EPA in 1986 and published a modified version of his research in a peer-reviewed journal. It received almost no media attention. The data existed. It was technically public, but it had been so carefully filtered, delayed, and redefined that it might as well have been classified. This pattern repeated across multiple agencies and waterways. The Ohio River, subject to intensive industrial use since the 1950s, had documented dead zones by the 1960s. The data was tracked by the U.S. Geological Survey, but the most comprehensive reports, those detailing the extent and permanence of the damage, were classified as internal review documents and were not released publicly for decades. When they finally emerged in the 1990s through Freedom of Information Act requests, they were stripped of context, missing appendices, and accompanied by explanatory letters that reframed the findings. The Chesapeake Bay presents perhaps the most instructive example. By the 1970s, the dead zones there were undeniable. They were growing, they were spreading. The Army Corps of Engineers had data showing that certain dredging and channelization projects, which they themselves had authorized and overseen, had catastrophically worsened the problem. The engineers knew this. The data proved it. But the solution would have required admitting that major federal infrastructure projects had been counterproductive, that decades of work and billions in investment had, in fact, accelerated environmental decline. So the reports were filed, the data was collected, and it was simultaneously made unavailable to the public in any meaningful way. One former Army Corps engineer, who requested anonymity, described the process in a 1995 interview that was published in a small environmental magazine and then largely forgotten. We would generate these comprehensive assessments, he said. They'd sit in the office, sometimes they'd be presented at internal meetings, but the decision-making process was already finished. The project was going to move forward regardless. The report was just documentation, for the record, but not for the public record. End quote. That distinction between documentation and disclosure became the operational framework for decades. But here's where the suppression becomes more complicated and more disturbing. It wasn't only about hiding bad news. It was also about obscuring the permanence of the problem. Environmental science had undergone a profound shift by the 1980s. Researchers were beginning to understand that certain ecological damage might be irreversible on any human timescale. The concept of ecosystem resilience was becoming clearer, and it revealed something troubling. Once a complex system like a Great Lake or a major river corridor crosses a certain threshold of degradation, it doesn't simply bounce back when you stop polluting it. The system has been fundamentally restructured. The species composition changes, the water chemistry stabilizes at a new baseline, one that supports a much less diverse and productive ecosystem. This finding was anathema to the environmental movement of the time, which was built on an implicit promise. If we regulate pollution, we can fix the problem. If we pass the Clean Water Act, rivers will get better. If we establish the EPA, we can protect America's waterways. The early successes of these initiatives seem to confirm that promise. The Cuyahoga River, which had literally caught fire in 1969, did become less toxic. Some lakes did show measurable improvement in water quality, but as the 1980s progressed, it became clear that improvement wasn't the same as recovery. The dead zones persisted, some stabilized, a few even expanded despite regulations. The scientific data that would have revealed this complexity, the findings that would have forced a harder conversation about the limits of restoration, was quietly deprioritized, not explicitly hidden, but strategically understated, released in ways that prevented widespread understanding. Consider what happened with the discovery of microbial mat formations in the dead zones of Lake Superior. In the early 1990s, researchers discovered that in areas where oxygen had been depleted, certain types of bacteria and algae had colonized the lake floor. These microbial mats were bizarre. They existed in conditions that had previously been thought impossible for life. They were, in a sense, a sign of permanent ecological reorganization. The lake wasn't dead in those zones. It had been repurposed. It now supported a completely different kind of ecosystem, one that was dependent on the perpetual absence of oxygen. That research was conducted by scientists at a major university research institute. Their findings were presented at conferences. Papers were published. But the profound implications, that the dead zones were not temporary problems awaiting solutions, but permanent features of the landscape that would now require active management to coexist with, These implications were never translated into public discourse. The research existed in the specialist literature. It did not reach the policymaking level. It did not appear in media reports about lake restoration. Why? Because it was incompatible with the narrative that had sustained environmental investment for 20 years, that we could fix this if we just committed the resources and the will. The suppression of these findings was not a conspiracy. It was far more mundane. It was institutional interests aligning around a convenient silence. Environmental agencies wanted to maintain public support, which depended on the belief that their work was succeeding. Politicians wanted to point to water quality regulations as evidence of effective governance. Industries wanted to avoid the additional regulations that would follow from admitting that current approaches weren't working. And the general public, meanwhile, wanted to believe that the problem could be solved, that nature could be restored if we simply tried hard enough. Everyone had a stake in not fully acknowledging what the data was saying, that some of America's most important waterways had already undergone irreversible transformation, and we would be living with the consequences indefinitely. This is where the story takes another turn, because suppression of data is one thing, but suppression of interpretation, the systematic prevention of difficult conclusions being drawn from the data, is another layer entirely. In the 1990s, a research team at the University of Wisconsin began compiling historical records of water quality from the Great Lakes dating back to the 1850s. They gathered everything: shipping logs that recorded water clarity, fish catch records that indicated species distribution, geological core samples that showed sediment composition and chemical signatures, photographs from the turn of the century that documented the landscape, and early scientific surveys conducted by state agencies. What emerged was a detailed picture of how dramatically the lakes had changed, not just in the last few decades, but over the entire period of industrial use. The transformation was visible in multiple independent data sets. Fish species that had been dominant in the 1870s were completely gone by the 1950s. Water clarity had diminished by half. The sediment records showed the accumulation of industrial pollutants in discrete layers, each layer corresponding to a surge in industrial activity. This research was rigorous. It was peer-reviewed. It was published in prestigious journals. It was, by any measure, legitimate science. But when the research team tried to secure funding to continue their work and to expand their analysis to other regions and longer time periods, they faced obstacles. Federal research funding agencies were sympathetic to the work, but approval moved slowly. One review of their grant application raised concerns about the tone and framing of the research. It was, the reviewer noted, excessively focused on loss and decline rather than opportunity for recovery. The researchers were advised to reframe their findings in a more positive light. They declined. The grant was not renewed. This is suppression of a more insidious kind. It's not censorship. It's the weaponization of institutional processes, funding mechanisms, peer review standards, policy priorities, to discourage certain kinds of scientific inquiry and certain kinds of conclusions. The message being sent, whether explicitly or implicitly, was clear. Research that documents permanent decline is less fundable, less publishable, less career-wise advantageous than research that documents temporary setbacks and opportunities for recovery. Over time, this creates a systemic bias in the scientific and policy literature, not toward falsehood exactly, but toward a certain curated optimism, toward findings that are compatible with continued management and investment, toward interpretations that leave room for hope. The consequence, over decades, is that the full weight of what we actually know about our waterways never accumulates in public consciousness. The data exists, the research exists, but it's distributed across thousands of journals, hundreds of archives, and millions of documents that will never be read by anyone outside a narrow specialist community. And so here we are in the early 21st century, still operating under environmental policies and restoration initiatives that are premised on the assumption that these systems can be recovered, can be returned to some earlier state of ecological health, when the actual scientific evidence, taken in its entirety, suggests something far grimmer, that we are managing the slow, ongoing transformation of some of America's most vital ecosystems into fundamentally different kinds of systems. Systems that will never be what they were. Systems that we will have to learn to live with as they are. This is the darker knowledge that the suppressed records point toward. Not that we poisoned our waterways, we know that, but that in poisoning them, we transformed them into something else entirely. And that transformation is, for all practical purposes, permanent. The question that follows, the one that keeps appearing in personal journals and handwritten notes found in archives, is whether anyone truly understood what they were doing while it was happening. There are entry-level chemists who worked for these companies, men and women whose names never appeared in any lawsuit, whose warnings never made it to any official record, who documented what they were seeing in real time. They wrote about it in letters to family. They mentioned it in conversations that became stories passed down until someone finally decided to actually look for the evidence. One woman, a retired chemist from a facility near the mouth of the St. Louis River, gave an interview in 1998 that wasn't published in any major outlet. She described walking along the river with her supervisor in 1964, watching what she called transformation in real time. The water had taken on a distinct amber color. She asked if they should report it. Her supervisor's response was recorded in a small regional journal that most libraries no longer carry. He said, "We're not here to save the river. We're here to keep the plant running." That statement, that single prioritization, becomes the skeleton key that unlocks almost every suppressed record related to American waterway transformation. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't always accident. It was choice, systematized, and defended. And the suppressed knowledge isn't just what was done, it's that it was done knowingly. That decision makers understood the cost, weighed it against profit, and decided the profit was worth the permanent transformation of ecosystems that had existed for thousands of years. The records that would have made that calculation explicit, the internal studies, the risk assessments, the memo chains where the choice was made and justified, most of them were never released. Some were destroyed, others were buried so deeply in archives that they've never been properly analyzed or contextualized. If you want to understand the full scope of what happened, the chronology of the damage, the names of the people who knew, the specific decisions that were made to prioritize industry over watershed health, we've put together a comprehensive guide in the description and pinned comment. It goes much deeper into the documentary evidence, the testimony of environmental scientists who were sidelined, and the ecological consequences that are still unfolding today. What makes these suppressed records important now, decades later, after the transformations are irreversible, is that they tell us something about how institutional knowledge works. They show us that the people in positions to make decisions about our environment weren't acting from ignorance, they were acting from full knowledge and choosing profit. That knowledge has consequences for how we should approach environmental protection today. We tend to talk about environmental damage in terms of pollution as if the problem is just that we made the water dirty, and if we clean it up, we can restore it to what it was. The suppressed records tell a different story. They suggest that the damage was always understood to be permanent. That's why it was never fully disclosed. You can't commit to restoring something that decision makers knew was irreparably changed. So the records stayed quiet, the knowledge stayed suppressed, and the transformed waterways became the only reality most people ever knew. The landscape remembers what we did. The waterways remember what we chose. And in their transformation, they're trying to tell us something if we're willing to read the suppressed records, to listen to the voices that were sidelined, and to understand that some choices, once made, remake the world itself. If you want the complete investigation into these suppressed records, including the names of the facilities, the timeline of transformation, and the scientific data that was buried for decades, you can get the full guide in the description or in the pinned comment. It goes far beyond what we've been able to cover here. Thank you for watching. If you found this investigation valuable, please like the video, subscribe to Hollow Ground, and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next layer of America's suppressed history. The landscape is still speaking. We're just learning to listen.